Hi and welcome to another edition of Chinny Vision. This time we're looking at Uridium on the BBC Micro. Now the BBC Micro isn't a system that's best known for its quality arcade games. Okay, you've got games like Elite and Thrust, but you've also got games like the terrible conversion of Paperboy that's on the system, and I'm afraid 90% of games on the system are pretty much substandard compared to the other 8-bit platforms such as the Commodore 64, the Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. Today we're looking at Uridium, a game pretty famous for being a very fast moving arcade game, and can the BBC Micro handle it? Well, I think the best place to start actually is to look at the definitive version, so we've got something to compare against, and this is the Commodore 64 version. Great music on the title screen here, lovely level of presentation as you always get from Hewson. You start the game and basically what you've got to do is you're flying along this spaceship here and you've got to destroy everything on the spaceship and then land on it and set off a self-destruct sequence whilst avoiding all the baddies there that you can see are shooting at you. Really fast moving, lovely 50 frames per second scrolling here on the Commodore 64. Get to the end of this spaceship here, which they call dreadnoughts in the game, and we'll be told to land, which we do. Hopefully in any second. Let's get those out the way. Onto the airstrip there, or the landing strip rather. Flip back and then we land. Now we're inside the spaceship and what we're going to do is, this is a bonus screen where you either quit the screen or you get more points. You've got to react in time there, so we've got to quit the screen there. The destruct sequence is primed, got our bonuses, and now the ship is going to be destroyed. And there we go, lovely animation there as the ship's destroyed. As I say, this is the definitive version. I imagine it's probably the lead version as well. Each level's the same with progressing difficulty, slightly different colour backgrounds there, but all in all, it's an absolutely brilliant game. So, the question is, how does a fast-scrolling 50 frames a second game like this on the Commodore 64 translate to the BBC Micro? Let's find out. So here we are on my BBC Master, able to redefine the keys, which is a benefit, so we can actually play with a much more user-friendly Q, A, O and P setup that I prefer for this kind of game. Did try my joystick, didn't work. In fact, it crashed the game loading, which wasn't very helpful. I assume AIM are the guys who converted this for the Beeb. Same basic sound effects you got on the Commodore 64. And here we go. And it's quite garish, but the first thing that strikes you is, yes, this is Uridium. It's fast moving. I don't think it's the full 50 frames a second, but it's not far off. You die in exactly the same way as you do in the Commodore 64 version if you don't react in time. But aside from the slightly garish graphics, it's all here. This is a really good conversion. The ship layouts are exactly the same. The enemies appear in the same places, same kind of formations, same graphics. Slight differences here and there, but nothing major. You're basically getting the full experience here. And if we land now, there we go, landing there. Slight bug with BBC Master here. I don't get any characters on this screen. This is sometimes a problem with BBC B games running on the Master, that sometimes text characters disappear. And it does in the screen there. You don't get the destruct sequence on the BBC. You just flip straight through to the next level. So, as you can see, it's a pretty authentic conversion here on the BBC Micro. So the question is, if Uridium can be so good on the BBC Micro, why are there so many other rubbish games on the system? Okay, there's the games we all know of that are really good. Elite, Thrust, Frack, and games like that. But when you look at games like Paperboy that we saw earlier, It's complete rubbish. Uridium on the BBC Micro is actually of a standard that you'd find on the other 8-bit micros, the Spectrum, the Commodore 64, the Amstrad. Yes, the graphics are slightly garish, yes, the sound isn't quite as good as the other systems, but actually it's a conversion that really stands up there. And it's a game that's never really mentioned in the top 5 or 10 BBC Micro games you can play. Instead, people suggesting games like the rubbish Repton and dodgy arcade rip-off games like Killer Gorilla. Uridium is actually a really, really good port and one of the best games on the BBC Micro. If you own a Beeb, you owe it to yourself to seek out this game and play it and see what a really good game on the BBC Micro can be. And if you like Uridium, check out the BBC version. It's a really decent conversion and actually is head and shoulders above 95% of BBC Micro games.